Flashback. It's the 1940s. Something bad is happening. Ooh, wow, what's that? It's a little thing called the Holocaust. It's very bad. That Holocaust was killing and displacing millions of Jews across Egypt. My bad, not Egypt. Across Europe. Millions of Jews across Europe being displaced, and millions more facing bloodshed and extermination by the German military at the time. With that being said, Jewish people who are once again doing what Jewish people do, being oppressed, they decided that, you know what, I've had about enough of this. So, and mind you, this is going to be a very simplified understanding of this history. We can only do so much here. They were like, we need a home state. And they wanted to go back to the ancestral homeland of the Israelites, of Jewish people, Israel. But there was one big problem. There are people living there already. People who are already forming a sort of ethnic identity separate from the other countries that are that surrounded it in that very area that we call today Israel, and that is the Palestinians. Barefoot, shirtless, nothing in their pockets, escaping a genocidal state hell-bent on exterminating their religion, their ethnicity, their way of life. Jewish people from Europe and diaspora elsewhere come to the land that was known as Palestine and ask for one thing: a chance. And I'm not going to say it was perfectly easy, and not everyone gave them a chance, but they were able to make a home for themselves there, far away from the hands of the people who wanted to end them. They were also helped a lot by the people who were already living there. What were those people who were living there? What did they get in return? Let's read a little bit. These are statements from Israeli officials in the modern day. Palestinians are beasts. They are not human. This is the Deputy of Military Defense. What's so horrifying about the understanding that the entire Palestinian people is the enemy? They are all enemy combatants, and their blood shall be on their heads. Now this also includes the mothers of the martyrs who sent them to hell with flowers and kisses. They should follow their sons. Nothing would be just more. They should go as should the physical homes in which they raised the snakes. Otherwise, the little snakes will be raised there. The Sudanese are a cancer in our body. We will do everything to send them back from whence they came. Those are with us deserve everything. Those who are against us deserve their heads chopped off with an axe. Our soldiers are the only innocents in Gaza. Under no circumstances should they be killed because their false morality that prefers to protect enemy civilians. One hair on the head of an Israeli soldier is more precious than the entire Gazan populace, which elected Hamas and encourages anyone who murders Israelis. Where have you heard that sort of language from? I have an idea personally, but we can get there. Oh, there's another quote in here from 2012. I'm happy to be a fascist. From the current Minister of Culture and Sports. He's happy. Let's talk about what's been going on, what you've been hearing recently. Recently, there's been an escalation in the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. When I say that, what I mean is Israel's ethnic genocide of Palestinians in the area. All right. So where did this particular incident start? Well, it's a place, and these pronunciations are going to be bad. Personally, I do not speak Hebrew. I do not speak Yiddish. I do not speak Arabic. I speak English, American English, the good English. So these pronunciations are probably going to be bad. I'm going to try my very best to do them any sort of justice, but just to let you know, I'm going to mess them up, and that's going to be okay. I'm trying my best. Before we start, do not rely on me to be your only source of Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Do not allow this to be your only guide into what's been happening. Do not rely on this to be your only source of what's happening in this region. It's far more complicated than what I'm going to be telling you. We can only cover so much. I can only do so much. Someone who dedicates their entire life to understanding these crises couldn't even do this. Couldn't cover everything in a timely manner. You just can't. Let's talk about how these problems started. Well, in Sheikh Jarrah is what I believe it's pronounced. It is a sort of suburb of Jerusalem. If you've ever been around any religious people, if you've ever heard of the Bible, you've probably heard of Jerusalem, Nazareth, Bethlehem. This is the sort of area in the Middle East that we're talking about right here. Extremely holy sites to Christians, Jews, and Muslims. The three Abrahamic religions, we all tie back to these certain areas, these old cities. And that is one of the main contentions of what's going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians recently. And I want to go over this article by a journalist, a lawyer specializing in human rights and international law, living around this area as what's been going on recently has been going on. Let's talk about it. As I write, the worst clashes between Palestinians and Israelis since the 2014 war in Gaza are unfolding. On Monday, Israeli police stormed the Al-Aqsa, I think that's how it's pronounced, compound. Mind you, this is the third holiest spot for Muslims. This was during Ramadan. This is the third holiest spot for Muslims, period. This mosque here, which if I remember correctly, is according to the Quran, where Muhammad received the Quran. So extremely important place where thousands of worshippers had gathered to defend themselves from encroachment by settlers. 300 Palestinians and 21 Israeli officers were wounded. Hamas responded by firing hundreds of rockets from Gaza into Israel. We can talk about that in a moment. The violence began on Jerusalem Day, where Israelis celebrate the capture of the eastern part of the city during the 1967 Six-Day War. The atmosphere is far from tranquil in the city, and it's more like an arena of battle. Last month, at the beginning of Ramadan, Israeli police officers erected barriers to prevent Palestinian residents from the old city from gathering on the steps of Bab el-Amond and the Damascus Gate, one of the few public places available to them to congregate. Jerusalem's young Palestinians protested. After 2 weeks, the police removed the barriers. So this is where today's conflicts have started. But I'd like to talk about something else that helped fuel the problems that are going on here. I don't want to mince words when I talk about this, all right? I want to make sure that we keep everything as factual as I know them to be true, but I don't want to mince any words for you guys. Israel is a far-right, ethno-nationalist, genocidal apartheid state. That's just what it is. Headed by an ethno-nationalist, genocide-driven maniac, Benjamin Netanyahu. This is what it is, honestly. And it's not necessarily just like the state, even though the state itself is awful. Lots of the people residing in Israel, I'm not even just talking about Jews, I'm just talking about the people in Israel who aren't all Jews, just so you know, just in case if you didn't know that, are ready and raring to accept war crimes as a personal sort of collateral damage that has to be done in their quest to capture all of the old holy cities. It's 20% Arab. A way that we can see this happen is by the ethnic cleansing of eastern Jerusalem, which was mostly controlled by Palestinians, now has a lot of Israeli encroachment onto it. And the Israeli government is basically trying to push out all Arabs, all non-Jewish people out of the area to make it completely Jewish owned, which wasn't in the original borders, wasn't in the borders that were drawn up to 1967. They're just pushing well past the area of Eastern Jerusalem that should be that should belong to the West Bank, and they're doing it for one extremely big reason, which is to make all of Jerusalem owned by Israel. We can listen to one person here talking about their actual plan.
We take house after house. All this area will be a Jewish neighborhood. We are not finished the job. We are going to the next neighborhood, and after that we will go more. Our dream that all East Jerusalem will be like West Jerusalem, Jewish capital of Israel. אני רואה בזה המשך של המפעל היהודי-ציוני, המשך שיבת ציון, זה הכל.
Now, some people who are just listening, you may not be able to see this. He said, return to Zion. It is the Arab, we want to return to Zion. Is it at the Arabs' expense? Yes. But our government institutions were also built at the expense of Arabs who lived here. And so was the state itself. So, just outright admitting they want to push out all Arabs and move in all Jews. This is what they've called a simple property problem. So basically, what's happening is that Israel instituted a policy that said, in Jerusalem, if you can prove that your family lived in Jerusalem at any point in time, you then are able to move in and take that house, and the people who are living there, all Palestinians, will just be kicked off the street, kicked off into the street. That's just like what's gonna happen. Sorry, we're just going to do that. And they're forcefully evicting people from their homes. They are gathering people up, just kicking them out, and instantly they just move right back in. And that's just what's been going on. If not that, the Israeli government will go, hey, listen, this is a really important site. We really need this for archaeological reasons. So we're just going to kick you guys all out of the house. We need it for archaeology. We need it for all of these important things. So you guys can just go. Who knows? We may even find a sandal of Jesus in there, okay? You guys got to go. You guys got to go. Get out. And then they'll be like, oh, yeah, it's for archaeological reasons. We really need this house right now. But for some reason, later, you'll find an Israeli family living there just out of nowhere. This once really important archaeological site that the government needed to eminent domain take from these Palestinians, all of a sudden just given to Israeli citizens. Palestinians have even tried legally for a recourse to this action, but Israeli courts time and time again strike down Palestinians' efforts to maintain the homes that are rightfully theirs. And so this is what life is looking like for people in the West Bank and people in Gaza. At the moment, it is worse, and we can get there, but I'd like to move on for a little bit. As I mentioned, Hamas, a terrorist group. Mind you, let's be completely clear. I do not support Hamas. You should not support Hamas. Hamas says it's in the interest of the Palestinian people. Hamas has a lot of very, very shady ties, not only just Hamas itself, but to other Arab countries that are help funding it, arms of other governments that it plays to, and the fact that it does not support the main driving goals of Palestinians generally. Hamas outright claims that they would like to completely destroy Israel, the Jewish people. They are just absolutely anti-Semitic lunatics. They're not good people. You should not support them. I don't. You should neither. What I do support is people being able to protect themselves. And protecting yourself goes both ways. Both people in an argument should be able to protect themselves. But a lot of the times when people talk about one side protecting themselves, usually it's only Israel. And I think at this moment, Israel is very well protected. Let me show you something. This shit's called the Iron Dome. All right. This is what it looked like over Israel near Gaza when Hamas and other terrorist organizations started sending rockets over into Israel. These rockets right here is the Iron Dome. This is a interception, like a missile interception system that costs like millions of dollars. It's like super sci-fi. You would see this stuff in like an anime, okay? This stuff's crazy. It's super cool looking. I could watch this forever. Without any context, this would be incredibly magnificent sight to be able to strike down missiles that were coming. Reportedly, Hamas and other groups in Gaza sent over around 100 missiles. Only one even hit the ground. Only one. One side is very, very well protected. Let me show you what happened on the other side when Israel responded. Let me show you this real quick. La ilaha illallah. And that's what it looks like just going down the street in Gaza. Israel absolutely tearing Gaza to shreds. That's just what they're doing, to shreds. And as I said, Israel is an alt-right state. It's just what they are. They're an alt-right state. The people there subscribe to alt-right tendencies much more than even America. Because if we started doing this to like Mexico or something, there would be an outright outcry for what's been going on. Not in Israel. So much to the point where even citizens are catching front row seats to watch the action. As people are losing their lives, as people are being absolutely flattened in the Gaza Strip, people who have no connection whatsoever to Hamas, to terrorist organizations. Their lives are being ended. Their livelihoods, whatever livelihood they had. In the Gaza Strip, let me tell you a little bit something. There's a Gaza article for a while ago. Shush. Shush. I know. Let me tell you something a little bit about Gaza, all right? Around 50% of the population in Gaza are children. They have a 46% unemployment rate. They are crumbling. They have around, on average, 4 hours of electricity, near no internet access, aren't allowed to even fish in the Mediterranean. Israel won't allow them to. They're completely humanitarianly blockaded. They are blockaded by the sea. They're absolutely stuck in an open air apartheid state where Israel, every once in a while, when it feels like it, looks down and fires a couple of bullets into their barrel that they're stuck in. And says how awful Israel's being treated. Let me show you a little bit of something about let me show you a little something on the ground of what's been happening here. Let me show you a 10-year-old child on the ground in the Gaza Strip and how she feels about what's going on.
I'm always sick. I don't know. I can't do anything. See all of this. What do you expect me to do? Fix it? I'm only 10. I can't even do anything anymore. I just want to be a doctor or anything to help my people, but I can't. I'm just a kid. I don't even know what to do. I get scared, but not really that much. I do anything for my people, but I don't know what to do. I'm just 10. I'm just 10. All of this, when I see it, I literally cry every day, saying to myself, why do we deserve this? What did we do to this? My family said they just hate us. They just don't like us because we are Muslims. Why does Muslims act for you like that? We're just kids. We're just You see all of the kids around me? They're just kids. Why wouldn't you just send a missile to them and kill them? It's not fair. It's not fair.
She's got a point. It's not fair. Those children, like I said, represent 50% of Gaza's population. Now, what was Israel's justification for these bombings? Well, for one, they said that they were bombed first, mind you. This imperialization, this apartheid state of Palestine has been going on since the 1950s and 60s. You want to talk about who struck first? We can talk about that. I don't think people on the other side of the aisle would like to have that conversation. And also they say they only targeted buildings that had Hamas weapons in them. Now, Hamas, like I said, are bad people. Hamas uses human shields constantly. That's their MO. Hamas uses civilian buildings as their cover. That's their MO. That's not something the Israeli military is necessarily clean of. You can see pictures and videos of them tying Palestinian kids to the front of their cars as they drive with them. So snipers will have to choose between letting them go through so they can find so they can go to the edge of the Israeli and Palestinian borders to go use children as sniping, to use more children as sniping targets. That's a video I can't show you. It's a video that I found and I watched, but it's a video that I can't show you. It's of Israeli military finding Palestinian kids just playing on their side of the border and just taking pot shots at them, just taking them out and laughing as other Palestinians come by to take that person and hopefully find any help, any at all. It's not like they can take that person in to Israeli hospitals. Oh no, they're not worth that. So this is where we are at the moment, with 10-year-olds having to go on screeds about how it feels like every single day having your buildings bombed, having your life destroyed, having this oppressive force always at all points in time clamping down on your neck. That's what it feels like. And that's what's been going on for years, 70 years. And it seems like Israel is really stepping up their game, and they're looking to, well, I would say, finally end it. They're looking for a final solution to their Palestinian problem, as Benjamin Netanyahu was fighting off a coalition government that could have de-seated him. Just so you know, Israel has a parliamentary system. So basically, the prime minister is the person who's the head of the party that has the most amount of power. So he's been in power for, 10 years now? Over 10 years? Over a decade? He's been in power for an extremely long time because he's a hardline Jewish nationalist who favors the apartheid state, who favors bombing children, who favors blockading Palestinians until they are wiped off the map. We can get into that in a moment. Thankfully, at the very least, we have some people speaking out against what's happening. I want to play you this little segment. We won't play the whole thing, but I'd like to play you this little segment by Rashida Tlaib on the House floor a couple of days ago, after she got a letter from a Palestinian woman living in Gaza, if I believe.
I want to read something a mother named Iman in Gaza wrote 2 days ago. She said, quote, "Tonight, I put the kids to sleep in our bedroom so that when we die together." And no one would live to mourn the loss of another one.
That's the only thing that the Palestinians hope for at the moment. That when Israel comes to finally take them, at the very least, they'll all be gone. So no one will have to mourn the loss. Can't do this. Gonna dip. I told you it's very heavy segment. There are more people in the media speaking out about this, thankfully. I'm very happy to see something like that. I'd like to play you something from MSNBC's Ali Velshi, as he talks about the problems going on in Israel and he is just like me, not like to mince any words. I can only applaud him for this segment.
Palestinians are, at best, third-class citizens in the nation of their birth. The idea that it's even remotely controversial to call what Israel has imposed on Palestinians a form of apartheid is laughable. One look at a current map of Israel, Gaza, and the occupied territories conjures up only one other example: apartheid-era South Africa. The Israeli government, on an ongoing basis, declares parcels of land on which Palestinians live to be either of military or archaeological importance, causing residents to be evicted. Sometimes there's a court case, and almost always the Palestinians lose. Yet months or weeks later, that same important land suddenly becomes home to a brand new Israeli settlement. As more and more Jewish settlers take over land on which Arabs live, the occupied West Bank becomes de facto more Israeli and, in the explicit hopes of the Israeli government, more Jewish. This is a long-standing attempt and a deliberate attempt to force Arabs who have lived in that land, sometimes for hundreds of years, out. It's an attempt to dilute their presence, because to have Arabs as full participants is, in the opinion of the Israeli government and their courts, diluting Israel.
As they said, diluting Israel. This is not for security reasons. It's not for economic reasons. They're doing this to these people, that child that you just listened to, that mother whose only last wish, not a wish for a better world, not a wish for peace. Her only wish was just so when she dies, when her children die, when her husband dies, that they all die at the same time, so no one will have to live with the pain of knowing that they died. That's the only wish that those people have anymore. He goes on in the segment.
Traveling alongside an elderly Palestinian woman who is being transferred between 3 ambulances from Gaza to the no man's land in between and then into Israel to get cancer treatment. 3 ambulances over the course of 1 mile, more than an hour to cross the border. That's how Gazans live. Without medical treatment because Israel prevents it. Without electricity much of the time because Israel prevents it. Without the ability to fish in the Mediterranean Ocean because Israel prevents it. Without an airport or a seaport because Israel prevents it. Like Israelis, Palestinians also have a right to exist and to defend themselves. But there is no one willing to help them do that. Not the Israeli courts, and not the U.S. government. What the U.S. also shares with Israel is the belief that Hamas, the political party that governs Gaza, is a terrorist organization that calls for the destruction of Israel. Hamas is supported by the majority of Palestinians in Gaza. Hamas may not be in the best long-term interests of the Gazans, but peace hasn't really worked out for them. Faced with an Israeli government which pens them into what has been called the world's largest open-air prison, they have chosen a government that most of us wouldn't prefer, one that is not given to negotiation and moderation and respect for its neighbor. Israel needs a new approach to the Palestinians, and America needs a new approach to Israel.
I honestly couldn't put it better in my words. As we talked about with Hamas, because I want to touch on this. I want to make sure we don't forget this. Touch on Hamas. Imagine this for one moment. Do you live in America? Where do you live? You don't have to answer that question. I already know. But let's say in the country where which you live, your neighboring country, just out of nowhere, just decides, we're just going to own 90% of your country now. It's just that's what's it. You get bombed. You get plagued. It's something out of like a history book. Just get destroyed. You have nothing left, basically, like that woman. Have basically nothing left. Who are you going to turn to at the end of the day? Well, one person comes up and they say, well, all the peace talks didn't work. Every time you hear them talk about on the radio, talk about you, what do they say? You're beasts. You're animals. You don't deserve life. A mere hair on one of our citizens is worth every life in every single soul on that plot of land. Every soul, only a single hair. They're willing to kill every Gazan, every West Bank civilian, every child, every pregnant mother. every grandma, all of them, murder all of them, wipe them off the map for a single hair on an Israeli soldier. Even Hamas, the terrorist organization, has openly supported a two-state solution. If they go back to the 1967 borders between Israel and Palestine, or the West Bank, even they supported that. Netanyahu wants a cleansing. And they're starting to pick up speed. Let me show you a little bit more. So this is the Israeli military going after women in Sheikh Jarrah, that place that we talked about earlier in the stream. And with that being said, not only are the problems without Israel, as in like without the borders of Israel, there's problems also inside of Israel. As we mentioned earlier, as we touched on earlier, Israel isn't only comprised of Jewish people. There's about a 20% Arab population in Israel, voting population. Now, lots of Israelis don't want that. I think if I remember correctly, 50% of just young, I believe, like around 18, like Zoomer level Israelis want the right to vote be taken away from Israeli Arabs. There are also problems brewing inside of Israel as the ethnic nationalism ticks up. Obviously, problems come about from that, and there's a scene playing out or all across Israel right now that is something that you would have read in your world history class, especially when it comes to the Second World War. This is Israeli citizens. Let me mute this really quick. This is Israeli citizens prowling, looking for Palestinians to beat up. You see an Israeli flag here. Flipping Palestinian-owned cars, busting Palestinian-owned businesses and homes, finding any Arab, any Palestinian they can. There are several people injured that night. Several people injured. Tens, if I remember correctly. I'm not sure if it went into the hundreds. There were also sides of Arabs doing the same thing to Israelis in other parts of in heavier parts of Arab Israel as well. This is not anything like anyone should want to live in. Dozens were injured. Remember how I told you that Hamas would support a two-state solution, but Israel does not? Netanyahu comes out a couple of days ago and says, the bombings that you saw, the bombings that have continued in Gaza, will not stop until it's completely quiet. Israel vows to not stop attacks not stop any attacks in Gaza until there is complete quiet. Remind you again, they believe every single life in Gaza is worth less than a single hair on the head of an Israeli military operative. And with that being said, there's also a really big problem with Israel, all right? They really don't like what the media has been reporting about them. Now, you can see by like the IDF how they've been tweeting recently. If you didn't know, Israel's like defense system, troops, they've been they have their own Twitter. Not only that, they actually pay Israeli soldiers to actually make Twitter accounts and start fighting battles on behalf of Israel on Twitter. So maybe if you've been debating Israel, Palestine, Gaza, Jerusalem, the whole conflict online on Twitter, especially around the IDF page, there's a decent likelihood that you were debating an Israeli agent. It's wild, isn't it? Look at that. And who said being Twitter discourse had no meaning? Interesting that. Anyways, they have a really big problem, which is media. Media has been reporting very bad things about them, as you saw, like at least here in America, we had Ali Velci come out. We have the Squad coming out talking about it. We have lots of people on the left coming out about how awful the treatment of Palestinians and Arab Israelis are in Israel by the Israeli government. There are marches going on in London. There was a massive march on behalf of in support of the Palestinians. It's great, but they have a really big problem with the media there in Israel. They really hate the reporting. On top of that, remember how I told you how they say these buildings were being used by Hamas. Now, there has been no evidence to come out that they had any proof that any of these buildings were being used to house weapons by Hamas. Hamas does do that. They have no proof that these buildings that they destroyed specifically were holding Hamas operatives or equipment. They have no proof of that. And recently, just today, they bombed a press building, a building that held the offices of not only Al Jazeera, but also the Associated Press and other international news. That building that held news organizations for 15 years, all of a sudden saying, oh, hey, listen, man, those terrorists are just crawling all over that building. We just got to take it out, guys. And they took it out. Gave them 2 hours notice, told all of the reporters to get out within 2 hours, and they airstriked the building. Tearing the building to the ground. To the ground, with no evidence provided that any of these buildings whatsoever are being used by Hamas or any other terrorist organizations targeting Israel. It's starting to look very iffy about whether or not these buildings are actually real targets, or whether or not there's something that the Israeli government has really been trying to wipe out for a long time, because international news and what's been going on in Israel do not work hand in hand. As the people who are working in those buildings, the journalists said, the world will know less about what's going on between Israel and Gaza and the West Bank now that they destroyed those buildings, those headquarters with so much sensitive information with people for decades working out of. We will all know less about what's going on, war crimes committed by Israel or even Hamas and Palestinians, because they did this with no real justification. And when we have no real justification for the bombing of those buildings, there's no real end in sight for the war. I don't want to give you guys a false sense of hope and say that that child who was crying about living in high likelihood dying in the open air prison that is Gaza, the Gaza Strip, sorry. Needed a second. There's very little hope for those people. Let me be completely honest with you. As Israel starts to, especially through Trump's presidency, tightened up a lot of its relationships with other with other Arab countries, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan. They are given more and more leeway to oppress, subjugate, and cleanse their lands of Palestinians. And with global powers not stepping in to do anything, especially the U.S., who provides a lot of funding, to Israel, it is extremely hard to see, like, it's very hard to see them being able to put too much pressure on Israel at the moment to do much. Even if we pull out of Israel just completely, it's not like Israel is going to completely collapse. A fair number of their people, like a very large portion of their people, have military training and are willing to fight to keep Israel the way it is. That is going to be an extremely big battle. That's not something Israel just won't be rolled. It won't be rolled off the map into the sea. That's not just something that's going to happen. It's way stronger than that. It requires a lot more pressure from a lot more countries to actually force Israel to the table and force their hand to make them stop before it's too late for the Palestinian people. I remember the words of Michael Brooks, who talked about this back when he was alive. Rest in power, my dude, Reno. How he does not support Israel being a genocidal apartheid state. Some people ask, Shark, do you think that Israel has a right to exist? My answer for that is the same as the answer for Palestine. I believe that the people of those nations have the right to exist without the fear of bombardment, of blockades, have adequate funding, have adequate schooling, health, water, electricity, internet access, all of these things, all of the pleasures of life. I believe that they deserve. One group in there has almost all of the power, and that group is Israel. They have the power to stop this. They have the power to make something work. They don't care to. They want to kill. The country wants to kill. The government wants to kill. There's no solution to them outside of the forceful removal or the death of Palestinians in their quest to conquer all of that land. That's their goal. So to kind of wrap up, I'd like to say that we can help by, at the very least, making people aware of what's going on. Because you know who's not fucking helping? Joe Biden. As Bernie Sanders comes out with a scathing article in the New York Times saying the U.S. must stop being an apologist for the Netanyahu government, stop funding to Israel. Bernie Sanders was the only presidential candidate who said that if this happened, to follow Trump, which did almost the unthinkable, which was moving the U.S. embassy and recognizing all of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, with allowing them to just roll over Palestinians. That sort of precedent has been continued under Biden, who continues on to say that, President spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, reaffirming the strong support of Israel's right to defend itself against rocket attacks from Hamas and other terrorist groups in Gaza, and condemned the indiscriminate attacks against Israel. Barely nothing to be said about what they're doing to the Palestinians. They also spoke to the Palestinian Authority, President Abbas, and conveyed commitment to strengthen U.S.-Palestinian partnership. It's really easy to say that when you support the group that's trying to make the other group not exist anymore. And that's what we're working with right now. Biden currently allowing Israel to genocide Palestinians off the map, as Israel continues its further and further dive into fascism, into everything that their parents, that their grandparents, great-grandparents fled back in the time of the Nazis. They're creating that sentiment. They're cultivating that terror, those crimes against humanity again, against another group of people. And for what? Some land that you specifically call your own? To put people from a certain religion or ethnic group in the houses that you would want them to? That's what all of this is for at the end of the day. Israel has all of the defenses in the world. Israel's not going to crumble because of Hamas. Hamas is almost completely exhausted at this point. They have basically nothing. When Hamas fired that lobby of rockets into Israel, they didn't think they were going to wipe out Israel. Honestly, I think that they're surprised if even one hit. One did hit. Didn't even kill a single person. Injured someone. I think they got some shrapnel in their leg. That's it. As the Gaza Strip is currently being flattened until there is quiet. As the West Bank and Sheikh Jarrah is being ethnically cleansed, pushed out of their homelands. That's all they're doing it for at the moment. That's what all this pain and suffering is for. And that's it. Lots of people, when they watch that segment, lots of people when you watch the videos going on, lots of people when you read what's happening, it feels like something that you'd see in a reenactment of the Holocaust back in the 1940s. Lots of people, when they did that, when they went through history class, when they were sitting there and the videos were playing, and you'd see the pictures of Jewish people running from soldiers, and you'd see like the scrawny, the really skinny, like anorexic Jewish people who were liberated from like Auschwitz-Birkenau and everything. Lots of people sat there, and as they were in their chairs and as they're in their seats, maybe like me, lots of all of you guys, you go, how could people just sit around and let this happen? How could people sit around as millions are wiped off the face of the earth for no other reason but because another group of people felt like it? Well, you're watching it happen now. We are living through a history book. So what are you going to do? What's going to happen now? We're living in that timeline. We're the people, basically, sitting around as a group of people are faced with bombardment, apartheid, starvation, dehydration, malnourishment, and death. What are we going to do about it? You're living through another Holocaust. Okay, I'm done.